Yeah, so thank you ever so much to Jyotis. Thank you to Tim for inviting me. I'm going to try and make this session as usable for you guys as I can. I want to give you some tools that you can take away to think about some issues in culture. That's my aim. But I want to begin with a question. I want to ask you what you think about this. In your opinion, what are the greatest challenges for the church, for the Christian church today? How would you answer that question? I guess preserving the gospel would certainly be one of them. Evangelizing the nations, of course. But how about cultivating a biblical model for how Christians relate to culture? Would that be one of your big tasks for the church today? Let me read you something that Tim Keller wrote in 2019. He said, "I've been an ordained minister for nearly 45 years. When I entered the ministry, most of the divisions in the church seemed to be doctrinal. There were controversies about the charismatic gifts and Pentecostalism, about the end times and the second coming of Christ, about predestination and free will, about the meaning of baptism and the Lord's Supper. I entered a Presbyterian denomination which was in which there was a high degree of consensus on all those issues. And yet, today my church, like so many others, is sharply divided, despite the fact that its ministers can agree on a very long and detailed doctrinal statement, the Westminster Standards. So why all the conflict? Well, it's not so much over doctrine as over our relationship to what? The culture. As over what our relationship, to the culture should be. And as I look around, I see this same division roiling Christian denominations and organizations everywhere. So the way that Christians understand and relate to the culture then is not a niche question. It's a question with far-reaching implications. As Keller says, it's got the potential to divide Christian denominations. It's also got the potential to shipwreck the faith of Christians. I can think of a number of people in higher education who were Christians whose faith was severely rocked because they didn't have a workable way of relating their faith to culture. A wrong understanding of the relationship between faith and culture can also have the potential to alter the message that we preach. And it can either bless or hamper attempts to evangelize those around us. So it's an important question, and it's the question that I want to address in this session. I want to begin from the premise that any understanding of culture and how Christians should relate to it ought to be built from the Bible up. So I'm going to draw my principles for cultural engagement from the Bible. And today I'm just going to focus on one piece of the jigsaw, one biblical passage that can help us to think through a robust framework for Christian engagement with culture. There's a lot more to say, but I just want to try and do one thing in this talk. And I want to focus actually on Paul's engagement with what he calls Greek wisdom in 1 Corinthians 1 and the Hebrew desire for signs. And I think what we'll find is that Paul gives us a pattern in this passage that helps us explore contemporary Western culture in a way that allows the Bible to penetrate to its depths and to engage with it on a really quite profound level. So let's begin with 1 Corinthians 1. Let's just try and pull this passage apart a little bit and see what Paul is doing. Well, the first thing that he does is he identifies two of the dominant cultural values of his day in verse 22. Jews demand signs, he says, and Greeks look for wisdom. But what we're going to see, and what I think is really, really interesting about this passage, is that Paul doesn't simply affirm wisdom in the way that the Greeks already understand it. And he doesn't just endorse signs in the way that the Jews already understand them either. I just want to take the example of wisdom and work through the passage in terms of that. And I think we can split it down into three stages. Paul does three things with wisdom in this passage. The first one, in the box on the left here on the handout, is that he identifies what the culture wants. He identifies a dominant cultural value. It's not the only value knocking around in his society, but it's a major one. Greeks seek wisdom. But then he goes on to say that the Greeks can't be satisfied fully, in the deepest sense, in the wisdom that they're seeking. And they can't be satisfied in the fullest sense because God has made foolish the wisdom of the world, in verse 20. And also the world in its wisdom doesn't know God and thinks God's wisdom is foolish, in verse 23. So there's a frustration, if you like, built into, at its very deepest level, this Greek search for wisdom. But he doesn't leave it there. He then goes on to show how the fullness of what the Greeks are searching for can be found if they'll only look for it in the place that they'd least think it to be hiding. If they look to the cross, which for them is the epitome of foolishness, how could you get more stupid than dying on a cross? But if they look to the cross, they will find, much no doubt to their surprise, the fullness of wisdom. In fact, God's wisdom. And therefore, this leaves us with a very interesting double move in this passage. A double move of antithesis and fulfilment. Because on the one hand, it's very clear that Paul thinks that human wisdom and God's wisdom are antithetical. The wisdom of the philosophers for Paul is not some sort of halfway house to being God's wisdom. No. He says it is foolish. Worldly wisdom is not simply a couple of steps behind God's wisdom, or on its way to being God's wisdom. No, for Paul there's an unbridgeable difference. And the unbridgeable difference comes down to the cross. God's wisdom for Paul is cruciform, it's cross-shaped. And to the Greeks, that looks like utter foolishness. But he doesn't only strike a note of antithesis. He also, and at the same time, says that God's wisdom is the fullness, the fulfilment of everything that this earthly wisdom is striving for. Worldly wisdom and God's wisdom are not simply two alternative, irreconcilable traditions. You've got to choose one or the other. It doesn't matter which you choose, but you've got to make your choice. No, for Paul, God's wisdom is in fact, in verse 25, wiser than Greek wisdom. And so God's wisdom, and he uses the same term, both to describe human and divine wisdom, Sophia. God's wisdom embodies what worldly wisdom by its own lights is striving for, but can never fully attain. God's foolish wisdom is wise in a way that embodies the fullness of what human wisdom seeks, but it can only find it by setting aside its pride and coming to the foot of the cross. So note here what Paul is not doing. He's not offering some sort of lukewarm, wishy-washy third-way compromise between antithesis and fulfilment. A little bit of antithesis, a little bit of fulfilment. No, the antithesis is total, and the fulfilment is complete. He's doing both fully. So let's just pause and think, what can we learn from Paul here? How can we take this pattern? I think when we reflect on contemporary Christian culture in the light of what Paul is doing here, we find that what he brilliantly joins together, contemporary Christians tend to separate. Because we've got a tendency, I think, either to hammer on the antithesis between the Bible and culture, or to hammer on the fulfilment of the culture in the Bible. And those of us who want to stress the antithesis between Christianity and culture find it hard to countenance the idea that Christianity might actually be the fulfilment of the aspirations that are expressed in our culture's values. And those of us who see the gospel as the fulfilment of what culture seeks seldom emphasize the real and deep antithesis between the two. And this double movement of antithesis and fulfilment is captured really well, I think, in a term from the writer Daniel Strange, and he gets it from the missiologist J.H. Bavinck. He talks about subversive fulfilment. And what he's trying to get at is that the gospel, first of all, subverts the culture in that it confronts and unpicks and overthrows the world's stories, but that it also fulfills in that it connects and is shown to be worthy of our hopes and desires. And he encourages us to think of the Bible as wanting us to exchange our old stories for new ones, which turn out to be, quote, the originals from which our false stories are smudged and ripped fakes. And I think something of the marvel of this dynamic of subversive fulfillment is captured in C.S. Lewis's Great Divorce. Those of you who have read The Great Divorce will know that there's a passage in there where, set in the valley of the shadow of life, where people are waiting to enter heaven, they come as ghosts. And one ghost approaches with a lizard wrapped tightly around him, and the lizard is whispering in the man's ear, making it impossible for him to continue through into life. The lizard, we think, is probably a symbol of lust in this passage. And the man is confronted by an angel. And the angel says that he will kill the lizard so that the man can continue into life. And the man is terrified by this. He thinks he's going to be killed himself. Get back, he says, you're burning me. How can you kill it? You kill me if you did. The angel reassures him, no, that's not so. And after an agonized exchange, the ghost finally consents to have the lizard killed, and the angel wrings the lizard's neck, unleashing what Lewis calls a scream of agony such as I never heard on earth. And then, and this is a marvelous moment in this book, and then a remarkable transformation takes place. We witness not only the ghost transforming limb by limb into a man, but the lizard itself is transfigured. Let me read you how Lewis describes this. He says, so far from dying, the creature was still struggling and even growing bigger as it struggled. And as it grew, it changed. Its hinder parts grew rounder. The tail, still flickering, became a tail of hair that flickered between huge and glossy buttocks. Suddenly, I started back, rubbing my eyes. What stood before me was the greatest stallion I have ever seen, silvery white, but with a mane and tail of gold. So what has happened is that the man who feared being parted from his lizard now rides off on this amazing stallion. The lizard has transformed into a stallion. And the relationship between this lizard and this stallion is like the relationship between human wisdom and the wisdom of God. Because the stallion is both unrecognizably different, unrecognizably more glorious than the lizard, and yet, as Lewis describes it, also never more itself than it's been right now. It's both the antithesis of the lizard and the ultimate fullness of everything that the lizard so imperfectly and so dimly echoed. Timothy Keller tries to capture this complex dynamic of antithesis and fulfillment when he says that the gospel confronts, completes, and consoles every society's baseline cultural narrative. And it's an approach that prevents us from either being too completely antagonistic toward culture or totally affirming culture either. It also prevents us from choosing some sort of lukewarm compromise between antithesis and affirmation, sort of affirming some cultural values and opposing others as if they can be separated and judged one by one. I'd like now to change gear in this talk and to think directly about what characterises our contemporary culture? If Jews demand miraculous signs and Greeks seek wisdom, then what do moderns, what do contemporary people value? I wonder what you would answer to that question. Now, I'd love to hear it in the discussion time after the talk. In your view, what are the dominant values of our culture? I think one reason that this is a really hard question to answer is to do with what philosopher Charles Taylor calls the nova effect. Apparently, I'm no scientist, but I'm told that a nova is when a star explodes and its atmosphere suddenly becomes much brighter. And in a similar way, the nova effect for Taylor is an explosion of choices in society, different options for believing. And this has happened, he argues, in the last couple of centuries. And because of this nova effect, there isn't any more one single vision of the good life or one single value that dominates our culture. We live in a strange old culture, don't we? Ours is a materialistic age, but it's also an intensely spiritual age. It's a workaholic age, and it's an age obsessed by leisure. It's an age that says that your truth is as good as mine, and also says that those who don't conform to its truth should be punished. If there's one thing that unites everyone today, it seems to be our fragmentation, our disagreement about what the ultimate good is. But I think we can find a pattern emerging in our culture if we look not at what people value, but at how we value those things. And if we make that move, I think there are two, we could call them meta values, two ways of valuing things that emerge and that characterize our culture. And I want to call them freedom and efficiency. And so let's look at them one by one. First of all, freedom. I think freedom is a core value for us because whatever we choose, we value the freedom to choose it today. Now, this freedom is not what Isaiah Berlin famously called negative freedom. It's not simply a freedom not to be interfered with by governments and other people. I think it's a lot deeper than that, the freedom that characterizes our society. It's a freedom to make my own reality, a freedom to define my own meaning of existence, to choose good and evil for myself in biblical terms, to choose my own identity, my own world, my own values. To use a philosophical term, it's the freedom of being unconditioned, not subject to any constraints over the way that I see and construct myself and the world. And this radical idea of freedom has its origin in something called theological voluntarism, as John Milbank argues in his book Theology and Social Theory. Theological voluntarism is, of course, this idea that God's will is completely unconstrained by anything outside it. So the voluntarist God, for example, if he wants, can make 2 and 2 plus 2 equal 10. There's no constraint on his will, not even the laws of logic. And it's this radical theological idea of freedom that we find in voluntarism that I think has been transformed into the way in which we think about the ideal of freedom in our society today. We want to be free to make our own reality, to be our own creator. And this value has versions both on the political left and the political right. Everyone is doing this. It doesn't matter what identity I choose for myself. What matters is that I choose. Choice itself becomes the ultimate good. And let's call this the emancipatory attitude, the approach to life according to which I must be freed from all constraints so that I can make the world and myself according to my will. And this type of freedom has one very important consequence. It means that no one is now free not to choose. It's what the sociologist Peter Berger calls the heretical imperative. I have to choose. I cannot not choose. Being a Christian in our society is now a choice in a way that it wasn't in previous generations when pretty much everybody was a Christian. Obedience to God is a choice. Fidelity in a marriage is a choice. If I try and choose not to make myself and my world according to my will, it's as much a choice as if I choose to do so. A choice has become inescapable. Everybody chooses today. And this leaves us with what Charles Taylor again calls a cross-pressured existence. Whatever we've chosen, we question our choice and wonder whether we ought perhaps to have chosen differently. If I'm a Christian, I sometimes doubt that I've made the right choice. If I'm an agnostic or an atheist, I sometimes find myself wondering whether there really is a God after all. But this God-like freedom to define our own reality, I think, isn't the only value shaping our society today. And if we take it as the only value, we misunderstand at a really deep level the way that our society works. Because running just as deep in our culture is another value, the value of efficiency and productivity. In the late 19th century, this value of efficiency really took over in the running of factories. The gentleman on the left here, Frederick W. Taylor, he pioneered a mode of factory management developed to increase efficiency by evaluating every single step in the manufacturing process and breaking it down so in order to maximize its efficiency. He looked at the way in which people moved their hands and sort of made the most efficient use of their bodies. One effect of this was to break down a manufacturing process into lots of tiny repetitive tasks and to give one of these tasks to each person rather than having a skilled craftsperson who could make a whole chair or a whole car, for example. And the market economy that we live in is a great cultivator of this efficiency, because only the most efficient and the most productive ventures survive in a market economy. But according to the philosopher Michael Sandel, it actually goes a lot deeper than this in our society. He says we're not simply living in a market economy. Sandel says that we're living in a market society. And what he means, as he explains in his book, What Money Can't Buy, is that now the whole of life follows this pattern of the market. Everything is negotiated. Everything is bought and sold, including love and security and identity. It's a world in which everything is a contract. Everything is a deal struck for personal benefit. So our relationships with our families, with our partners, with the natural world, they're all business deals calculated to bring us profit, though we'd rarely be so unguarded, of course, as to say that truth out loud. The essence of this market is competition. And so in the market society, everything becomes a competition. From a very early age, I compete at school for the best grades. I compete for a place on the sports team. I compete for a boyfriend or girlfriend. I compete to go to college. I compete to get a job. I compete to get a promotion. I compete to get a spouse. When I've got children, I feel the pressure for them to do well in their competition with other children at school. I compete in the housing market. I compete in the jobs market. And I compete on the social media market for identity. So my life is really just one long string of competitions. And the Christian philosopher Jacques Ellul is very insightful about this deep value of efficiency. He calls it technique. And his analysis, I think, helps us appreciate just how deep and wide this technique runs in our society. He defines it in the following way. He says, technique is the totality of methods rationally arrived at and having absolute efficiency in every field of human activity. Technique for Ellul is never anything, he says, but a collection of means and the search for the most efficient means in any given situation. In fact, the search for ever better means becomes in itself an end. Efficiency itself becomes the good rather than serving some good outside itself. So today then, technique is not something out there in the world. It's how we do everything that we do in the world. We've adopted what we might call a technical attitude, a way of approaching the whole of life from the point of view of efficiency, with a view to optimization. And note where this language comes from, this language of efficiency and optimization. It's a language, isn't it, of engineering, of machines, of the steam engine or the microchip. And taking this language of machinery and applying it to the whole of life is no accident, because the modern world comes back time and again to seeing human beings as machines. There's the foundational modern political theory of Thomas Hobbes, and the beginning of his great book Leviathan, where he describes a human being precisely as a machine. And thinking of humanity in the image of the machine in this way is no innocent metaphor, is it? Because if people are fundamentally springs and strings and wheels, as Hobbes argues they are, then it becomes legitimate to treat and manipulate them in certain ways, just as we would any other machine. Closer to our own day, we also see this technical attitude in the behaviorism of the early 20th century that tried to manipulate human behavior by reducing it to a set of inputs and outputs. We also see it today in the language of mind hacks and brain hacks, the proliferation of meticulous daily planners and self-improvement courses that promise to make our lives more efficient and more productive. And we see it in the social media algorithms that fiercely compete for our attention. And just like the emancipatory attitude, this technical attitude has swept over the whole of life. Everything is thought of in terms of being efficient or inefficient, optimized or non-optimal. Is this, for example, the optimal person to marry, we might ask ourselves, or the optimal person to remain married to? Is this the optimal friend I could have, the optimal church I could attend, the optimal version of myself to be? And perversely, this optimization even colonizes our leisure time. Surely it's a painful irony when we want to make the most efficient and productive use of our holidays. And if we're Christians, we search for the optimal way to spend our Sabbath. In fact, efficiency dominates our relationship to time as such. We're always on. We're always available. We live in a 24/7 society. And the market is very aggressive in its desire to monetize our attention, to make us more efficient as generators of profit. You may well have heard the famous quote in 2017 from the CEO of Netflix, Reed Hastings, who famously declared that the greatest competitor to the Netflix platform was in fact sleep. And the longer we're awake, you see, the more efficient our existence can be, the more revenue we can generate for the corporation, the more our life is optimized for the market. The philosopher Slavoj Žižek argues that the cult of productivity has also co-opted the contemporary mindfulness and meditation industry as well. Why do we engage in mindfulness? Why do we do meditation? Well, because we can then be more productive after us. It renews us so that we can throw ourselves back into our work with new energy. So even our non-productivity can be made to serve our efficiency. And so these two values of unconstrained freedom and ruthless efficiency, contrasting though they are, actually work together in modern society. We compete to be free in an optimal way. We strive to craft our own identity and then we express it for others to like and to validate. We've created a market for self-creation. It's the perfect marriage, isn't it, of the emancipatory attitude and the technical attitude. So where does this leave us? Well, it leaves us, I think, both making too much of ourselves and also at the same time making too little of ourselves. We make too much of ourselves when we think of ourselves as voluntarist gods, creating the natural world in our own selves according to our unconstrained will. But then we make too little of ourselves when we treat ourselves like machines to be optimized and made more efficient. We make ourselves both a god and a machine at the same time, or as Blaise Pascal puts it, in his Pensées, humans are neither angels nor beasts. We could say neither gods nor machines. And the misfortune is that the one who would act the angel acts the beast. Now, note that it's not God or machine here. It's God and machine. So when we lose the biblical picture of human beings, we tend both to make too much and too little of ourselves at the same time. Remember from the first section of this talk how Paul treats wisdom and signs in 1 Corinthians 1. He showed that those who follow these values can't have the fullness of them in the way that they're searching for them at the moment. And the similar thing is true of freedom and efficiency. The contemporary idea of freedom can't cash the checks that it writes, and efficiency can't deliver on its promises. And I want to examine why now. Let's take freedom first. There's an irony. It's a painful irony to the voluntarist desire to create a world and to create myself according to my own will. The irony is that this need for self-creation also has to be recognized. It has to be validated as good. But no one is left in the voluntarist world with the authority to pronounce that judgment on my will, because I am unconstrained. So what do? Well, we seek validation from the crowd. Surely if enough people tell me that my creation is good, then it will be good. I need others to recognize and affirm what I've created. No one has the right to define me, but I need people to see me, and I need people to affirm me. The Christian writer Alan Noble puts it this way. He says, "We all live before the gaze of someone or something. Our heart's desire is to be affirmed by that gaze, so that our lives are justified. Our place in the world is certain, and the trajectory of our moral and social life is clear." So then the agonizing tension that we're living in our society today is that we're told you must make something out of your life, and no one has the right to tell you what it should be. But you need a voice from outside yourself to justify your choice, to pronounce on your voluntarist creation the benediction, "and it was good." Your self-creation, therefore, must pass the daily trial of social media. But as we all know, social media is a fickle and restless God, and it delivers a very capricious final judgment. And what about efficiency? Well, just like the emancipatory attitude, the technical attitude also fails to deliver on what it promises, namely efficiency and optimization. Or rather, it delivers efficiency and optimization, but in a way that is actually damaging to humanity, not ennobling of humanity. Think about the gig economy and 0 hours contracts. They're exquisitely efficient in terms of cash flow for corporations, but they exploit workers and they damage families. The desire to squeeze every ounce of efficiency out of our lives leads to burnout and stress-related injuries. And this cult of competition that bubbles up in the technical attitude is supported by an ideology of meritocracy. And Michael Sandel so helpfully puts his finger on this in his book, The Tyranny of Merit. This idea that everyone who succeeds has earned their success, and therefore, by implication, everyone who fails has earned their failure or deserves their failure. Sandel argues it makes the winners arrogant and it makes the losers resentful. So then, our two core meta-values fail to deliver what they promise. Self-creative freedom promises that we will become a deity in our own little world, but it delivers slavery to the whim of the crowd on whom we rely for recognition and validation. And efficiency promises optimization, but it delivers stress and burnout, and a society divided between the entitled proud and the destitute resentful. But remember, Paul doesn't stop there. Paul shows how these values can be taken on a journey that reaches fulfilment in Christ. He doesn't say, does he, in 1 Corinthians 1, stop looking for wisdom, or don't seek power at all. No, he tells the Greeks and the Jews that they're searching for these things in the wrong place. And in the same way, I think we would do well to say that it's not the desire for freedom in itself. It's not the desire for recognition of that freedom. It's not the goal of efficiency itself that's an evil. But the 1 Corinthians 1 view says that we will only ever find the fullness of those things. We can only ever, if you like, kill the lizard for the stallion to arise in Christ. First of all, freedom then. True freedom is found only in Christ. When we come to the cross, we find a God who, first of all, sees us as we really are. He sees our selfishness and our duplicity along with our good instincts. He sees everything about us. We are seen and we are known at the deepest possible level. And as God sees us, he neither validates all our sins and flaws, nor does he look away in disgust. Now, he does something much more profound than either of those. He holds out the promise of a new self, a renewed self, a stallion self, if you like, or what Paul in Colossians 3 calls a new creation. Paul writes, do not lie to each other, since you have taken off your old self with its practices and have put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge in the image of its creator. And God's recognition of us is not like that of the fickle crowd that projects onto us its own desires and fits us into the story that it wants to tell about us. Now, God's recognition is a loving, unconditional recognition that meets us right where we are, but also takes us where we could never hope to have arrived. It's not an identity that we have to create ourselves. It's not a performance to be evaluated by a panel of judges. As Paul again wonderfully says in 1 Corinthians 15, by the grace of God, I am what I am. And this is the Bible's picture of real freedom. Those of us who have read Francis Schaeffer will remember he used to talk about true truth. I think here, similarly, we might talk about freedom, the freedom that isn't shackled to the fickle court of public opinion. So what about efficiency then, and optimization? Well, efficiency and optimization rely on an idea of a fundamental lack. They don't work without lack. There is scarcity. That's why we need competition. Enough is never enough. That's why we need endless optimization and an endless increase of efficiency and increase of profits. The logic is this, isn't it? My rivals are getting better all the time, so I must too. They're becoming more efficient. I must become more efficient too. You must work harder if you want to be in the 1%, if you want to be in the winners rather than among the losers. And that is simply the way the world is, if the fundamental reality is the market. But it is a lie to say that the fundamental reality is the market. Because when we look at reality through a biblical lens, this world isn't grounded on an original lack, but on what we can think of as an original prodigality. And the fundamental gesture of social relations isn't market exchange, it's the free gift. Theologically speaking, we see this in the truth that God didn't make the world out of necessity or out of lack because he had to, or because he wasn't complete. God made the world out of love. And Paul reminds us in Acts 17 that God isn't needy, he didn't lack anything. He says the God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth. And he doesn't live in temples built by human hands. And he's not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. So Jesus didn't come to earth to die on a cross because he lacked anything, but because he loved us and because he was obedient to his Father's will. So love, not lack, is the motivating force behind social relations. And reality is shaped most fundamentally by faithfulness and gift, not by contract and exchange. And this is also true on a human level, sort of if we set the Bible aside for a moment, isn't it? I'm cared for by my parents and by my guardians when I'm a baby as a gift, before I can ever pay them back. And by the time I enter the market system, I benefited from and I've blessed others with countless gifts that I don't expect to be repaid. So the good life of optimization and efficiency, the life of thinking that I'm in the fast lane, that I'm in control, that I'm making the best of my life, it is all so fragile when it's subject to the laws of competition and lack. But when I see my life as a free gift and my righteousness as a free gift, then I am liberated to be generous in turn and to rest in the fullness of the righteousness that the technical attitude can never enjoy, because it must always optimize, it must always have more. It can never be at rest. So then, to conclude, this 1 Corinthians 1 approach is one model of Christian cultural critique drawn from the Bible. It neither simply rejects culture, nor does it simply seek to imitate culture. And it shows, I think, how the Bible can confront, complete, and console our culture's deepest values. Thank you.